Today we're going to cover Chapter 6 of Propaganda. If you want to follow along without using the video, you can find the show notes at howtoeatanelephant.xyz. You can also find a donate button there if you like what I'm doing, find it useful. If you are following along, I've highlighted my notes in blue, and the orange and yellow denote what I think is important and very important. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you below. And with that said, let's get started with Chapter 6 of Propaganda. The title here is Propaganda and Political Leadership. This is one of the videos that I've been, I don't want to say anxious to make, but I think this is where my point is going to start to come to a head. Bernays begins this chapter by saying, quote, "The great political problem in our modern democracy is how to induce the leaders to lead. The dogma that the voice of the people is the voice of God tends to make elected persons the will-less servants of their constituents. This is undoubtedly part cause of the political sterility of which certain American critics constantly complain." And I find it interesting right off the bat that, like I said, this book is 100 years ago, that their leaders also did not lead. Today, our quote-unquote leaders are a little more than figurehead puppets dancing to distract the masses. They weren't, and certainly aren't, servants of their constituents. Realistically, they're more like servants to their donors. Whoever's paying for the tune is who gets to, call the tune. Bernays continues, "No serious sociologist any longer believes that the voice of the people express any divine or specially wise and lofty idea. The voice of the people expresses the mind of the people, and that mind is made up for by its group leaders in whom it believes and by those persons who understand the manipulation of public opinion. It is composed of inherited prejudices and symbols and cliches and verbal formulas supplied to them by their leaders. Fortunately, the sincere and gifted politician is able, by the instrument of propaganda, to mold and form the will of the people." And here he goes again, talking about how the masses will be molded by the propagandists, in this case through gifted politicians. And if the masses' will has been molded by this external force, can it rightly be called the masses, the will of the masses? If I essentially trick you into believing something, is that really your will, or is it mine? He continues, "Unfortunately, the methods of our contemporary politicians in dealing with the public are as archaic and ineffective as the advertising methods of the business in 1900 would be today. While politics was the first important department of American life to use propaganda on a large scale, it has been the slowest in modifying its propaganda to meet the changed conditions of the public mind. American business first learned from politics the methods of appealing to the broad public, but it continually improved those methods in the course of its competitive struggle, while politics clung to the old formulas." And here we have an example of what I was pointing out in the last chapter. If propaganda is used to manipulate a country to buy this product or that service, it isn't really the end of the world. You would kind of expect the people trying to sell you things to make their products and services appear better. But, and this is the big but, if propaganda techniques are used to manipulate a nation's politics, I think the consequences are much more sinister, much more dire. Bernays continues, "The political apathy of the average voter, which we hear so much, is undoubtedly due to the fact that the politician does not know how to meet the conditions of the public mind. He cannot dramatize himself and his platform in terms which have real meaning to the public. Acting on the fallacy that the leader must slavishly follow, he deprives his campaign of all dramatic interest. An automaton cannot arouse the public interest. A leader, a fighter, a dictator can. But given our present political conditions, under which every office seeker must cater to the votes of the masses, the only means by which a born leader can lead is the expert use of propaganda. And I'll say that, well, those 100 years of practice that they've had since this was written have certainly paid off. And today, and I would say for the last 2 or 3 generations, possibly longer, I'm obviously not privy to that, I suspect that politics has been dominated more and more by the dramatic. I am reminded of a quote I've heard years ago many times. Washington, D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people. Now, I think this is a real accurate assessment, to be perfectly honest. We see like Ronald Reagan, he was literally an actor. Clinton was known as Slick Willie, and he had this very dramatic, the Lewinsky cigar, depends on what you mean by is or whatever he said. I remember hearing that George W. Bush would be a great guy to have a beer with. Like that has any bearing whatsoever on your ability to lead a nation. His likability. And Trump, more recently, is a very kind of a new breed of celebrity. He had the television show. I don't remember what it was. But he's certainly a public figure, an entertaining figure, almost before he is a businessman, and certainly before he's a politician. Now, these people and others like them use their drama to quite successfully appeal to the public. And yet we have some counterexamples of, I'm going to say here, Ross Perot, who seemed to be, I was young at the time, but he seemed to be very logic-driven. He had his charts and graphs, and he was talking about how NAFTA was going to end up, that sucking sound you hear is all the jobs going to Mexico. And he was right. I mean, he was right on almost everything he said, as far as I know. Like I said, I was very young. And he was actually winning, but from what I understand, he was threatened to drop out of the race. I don't know how much of that's true, but it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever. But again, the point here is that our modern leaders, for however many generations it may have been actors, have been entertainers maybe, almost before politicians. If they're not entertaining, they're not going to have the cameras put on them. They're not going to be in the public mind. They're not going to get the votes. So you really have to, like I said, be an entertainer before the people will even pay attention to you. Bernays continues, quote, whether in the problem of getting elected to office or in the problem of interpreting and popularizing new issues, or in the problem of making the day-to-day administration of public affairs a vital part of the community life, the use of propaganda, carefully adjusted to the mentality of the masses, is an essential adjunct of political life. And here we see my major concern. If you take anything away from all of these presentations I'm doing, it is that propaganda, while used in politics, can allow someone or group of people to shape nations. The consumer side is merely used as a demonstration. When I talk about, and Bernays talks about, the velvet and the soap and all that stuff, the consumeristic side of things, like those are just examples of how well you can manipulate someone to buy soap. But it is, I think, just as easy to get people to vote one way or the other as it is to buy soap or velvet. And we see today that the modern day influencer is also, I think, a valid concern, because as society continues to, I'll say, wither under these anti-intellectual pressures, it's seen oftentimes not cool to be smart or educated. You're going to have your very narrow opinions. I think Chomsky, and I'm not a huge fan of him, but he said something like, Americans have very few actual issues that they care about, but within those few issues, they have very lively and vibrant debate. Something like abortion, that really riles people up, or LGBT, or the immigration these days. There are these few issues, hot button topics, and elections are often made or lost based on people's opinions on one or two of these hot button issues, where things like the more boring things, the more intellectual side of things, like inflation. Most people don't really even understand how inflation works. They just think of prices going up and that's inflation. It's not exactly correct. Prices going up is a a downstream effect of inflation, which is an increase in the monetary supply. But talking like that and trying to explain these things to people, it's not sexy. It doesn't get you riled up. And so back to my point is these sort of influencers today, social media influencers, are going to be used by the propagandist, even if the influencer themselves doesn't know what they're doing. They're promoting either like promiscuity in the young girls or obesity in everyone and all of these other really bad habits, which are, I'll say, anti-intellectual, but then they further make your ability to even think about topics other than these hot buttons even harder. I'm having difficulty expressing what I want to express, but hopefully, if you just follow along, we'll dig deeper into it. Bernays continues, "The successful businessman today apes the politician. He has adopted the glitter and the ballyhoo of the campaign. He has set up all the sideshows. He has annual dinners that are a compendium of speeches, flags, bombast, stateliness, pseudo-democracy, slightly tinged with paternalism. On occasion, he doles out honors to his employees as much as the Republic of classic times rewarded its worthy citizens. But these are merely sideshows, the drums of big business, by which it builds up an image of public service, an honorary service. This is but one of many methods in which businesses stimulates loyal enthusiasms on the part of directors, the workers, the stockholders, and the consumer public. It is one of the methods by which big business performs its function of making and selling products to the public." Now here again we see that business is only really interested in selling that product. And to do that more effectively or most effectively, they want to create an image of themselves. Now they don't want to actually be that image. They want to present an image, a false image, a veneer. And that is what the public finds appealing. And this, again, is done solely with the ends of profit in mind. And if you apply this to politics, it's going to be the same thing. The politician is going to create an image of what he thinks that the public is going to find appealing. How many politicians are going to say, vote for me and I'm going to lower taxes, but then the taxes never get lowered. Vote for me and I won't start any more wars, and then more wars get started. Right? The campaign promises seem to never align with the practical day-to-day operations after the shyster is elected. Bernays continues, "Political campaigns today are all sideshows, all honors, all bombast, glitter and speeches. These are, for the most part, unrelated to the main business of studying the public scientifically, of supplying the public with a party, candidate, platform, and performance, and selling the public these ideas and products. Emily Newell Blair has recounted in The Independent a typical instance of the waste of effort and money in political campaign. A week's speaking tour in which she took part of herself. She estimates that on a 5-day trip covering nearly 1,000 miles, she and the United States senator with whom she was making political speeches addressed no more than 1,100 people. Those votes might conceivably have been changed as a result of their efforts. The cost of this appeal of these voters, she estimates, calculating the value of the time spent on a very moderate basis, as $15.27 for each vote which might have been changed as a result of the campaign. And remember that $15 100 years ago was an awful lot of money in reality. This, she says, was a drive for votes, just as an Ivory soap advertising campaign is a drive for sales. But she asks, what would a company executive say to a sales manager who sent a high-priced speaker to describe his product to less than 1,200 people at a cost of $15.27 for each possible buyer? She finds it amazing that the very men who make their millions out of cleverly devised drivers for soap and bonds and cars will turn around and give large contributions to be expended for vote-getting in an utterly inefficient and antiquated fashion. And here we see explicitly stated that politics is in the business looking for an efficient manner to buy votes in exactly the same way that Ivory Soap is looking to sell more bars of soap. Bernays continues, big business is conducted on the principle that it must prepare its policies carefully, and that in selling an idea to the large buying public of America, it must proceed according to broad plans. The political strategist must do likewise. The entire campaign should be worked out according to the broad basic plans. Platforms, planks, pledges, budgets, activities, personalities must be carefully studied, apportioned, and used as when big businesses desire to get what it wants from the public. The first step in a political campaign is to determine on the objectives and to express them exceedingly well in the current form, that is, as a platform. In devising the platform, the leader should be assured that it is an honest platform. Campaign pledges and promises should not be lightly considered by the public, and they ought to carry something of a guarantee principle and money-back policy that an honorable business institution carries with the sales of its goods. The public has lost faith in the campaign promotion work. It does not say that the politicians are dishonorable, but it does say that the campaign pledges are written on sand. Well, I'll say it. Politicians are dishonest. If you don't think so, you're not paying attention. And I wonder, even if 100 years ago, how true these statements were. And if the people thought that the campaign pledges were written on sand 100 years ago, what are they written on today? They're written on nothing. They're hot air. Now, does anyone actually trust these modern candidates? No, of course you don't. And how often would you say that when you vote, if you even vote, are you voting against the other guy? How often do you hold your nose and vote for the lesser of two evils? When was the last candidate that actually gave you hope that something might improve? I mean, Obama, he ran on hope and change, but we got more of the same. There might have been hope, but hope is a pretty terrible strategy. Trump ran on Make America Great Again, and, well, we got more of the same. Both sides will tell you what you want to hear. Both sides will repeat their slick slogans, and both sides will sell you down the river once they have your vote, assuming that your vote even matters if someone like Dominion is counting the votes. Bernays continues, to aid in the preparation of the platform, there should be made as nearly a scientific an analysis as possible of the public and the needs of the public. A survey of the public's desires and demands would come to the aid of the political strategist, for whose business it is to make a proposed plan of the activities of the party and its elected officials during the coming terms of office. And again, we see here that they're studying the public, in his own words, very scientifically. And they're doing this not so they can understand what the public wants so much as they can understand how to play the human organ, to know which chords to pluck to get us to sing the song of rallying behind them. If a person were to run for office and actually want to improve the nation, they would study the problems and then offer solutions. Whether it's the public would be accepting of that and vote for these solutions is a problem of morals and education, not pandering. Again, they're studying the public to see, what do we have to look like? What image do we have to present to get your votes? When I think a more rational approach to leading a nation would be to look at what are the problems we're facing, understand those problems, and then offer solutions. Now, whether the solutions work or not is something to be seen, but I would much rather hear about solutions rather than, oh, my competitor is a bad guy and I'm really good because I, kissed a baby. And I think also that many, if not most nations today are suffering from this. Decades of poor policies, because the policies are not at the forefront. It's the dramatization, the celebrity status. Now, to undo these bad decisions, I think sacrifices are going to have to be made. And I don't think that the modern voter wants to make any of these sacrifices. They don't want to take responsibility, the modern voter. They don't want to roll up their sleeves, and they don't want to do the unpleasant work that needs to be done. They want instant gratification, and they want a savior. They want to elect a guy, and I think we saw this last cycle with Donald Trump. Oh, he's really going to drain the swamp. No, he's not. No politician, no one man is going to fix this. It's going to take the work of all of us. And I think that someone is simply not going to get elected if they stand up and say, hey, you guys are pissing your money away buying your Starbucks every day and buying your new cars and taking your vacations and buying we've got $100 a month we're spending on streaming services. Meanwhile, all that money is flowing directly out of your pockets, hard-earned money, flowing directly out of your pockets and into the pockets of the corporations who are buying the politicians that are not solving our problems in the first place. Bernays continues, a political campaign should be similarly budgeted to a business. The first question, which should be decided, is the amount of money that should be raised for the campaign. This decision can be reached by a careful analysis of campaign costs. There is enough precedent in business procedure to enable experts to work this out accurately. Then, the second question of importance is the manner in which this money should be raised. Charity drives might be an excellent model for political fund drives. And we absolutely see this today. Political campaigns will put forth this sort of grassroots personality to appeal to the common man. And I remember Hillary Clinton did this, and I think I've seen ads where now Kamala Harris is doing this currently, where they're not necessarily asking for donations, but they're saying, hey, can you chip in $5, $10? Now, they're still soliciting these massive donations from the mega donors and the political action campaigns, but they're leaving no couch unrummaged for every penny that they can get. Again, these people solicit donations to the tune of millions, tens of millions of dollars sometimes from a few big donors, and they want our $5? Don't give it to them. None of them. Don't give it to any of them. It's your money. You worked hard for it. You keep it in your pocket. He continues. Again, as in the business field, there should be a clear decision as to how the money is to be spent. This should be done according to the most careful and exacting budget, wherein every step in the campaign is given its proportion of importance, and the funds allocated accordingly. Advertising in newspapers and periodicals, posters and street banners, the exploitation of personalities in motion pictures, in speeches and lectures and meetings, spectacular events, and all forms of propaganda should be considered proportionally according to the budget and should always be coordinated with the whole plan. Big business has realized that it must use as many of the basic emotions as possible. The politician, however, uses the emotions aroused by words almost exclusively. To appeal to the emotions of the public in a political campaign is sound. In fact, it is an indispensable part of the campaign. But the emotional content must, A, coincide in every way with the broad basic plans of the campaign and all of its minor details. B, be adapted to the many groups of the public at which it is to be aimed. And C, conform to the media of the distribution of ideas. The emotions of oratory have been worn down through long years of overuse. Parades, mass meetings, and the like are successful when the public has a frenzied, emotional interest in the event. The candidate who takes babies on his lap and has his photograph taken is doing a wise thing emotionally, if this act epitomizes a definite plank in his platform. Kissing babies, if it is worth anything, must be used as a symbol for a baby policy, and it must be synchronized with a plank in the platform. But the haphazard staging of emotional events without regard to their value as part of the whole campaign is a waste of effort, just as it would be a waste of effort for the manufacturer of hockey skates to advertise a picture of a church surrounded by spring foliage. And here we see, just as I said before, emotions, not logic, not solutions, not even an understanding and clear stating of the problems are even mentioned. as regard to the political campaign. Emotions are what has been driving politics for at least 100 years now, probably even longer, maybe even forever. And emotions is why we find ourselves near, or even depending on where you live, in a dystopian world. This idea of we need to hire people based on the color of their skin or their sexual preferences leads to, Boeing jets falling out of the sky, and places like San Francisco that once were beautiful cities that are now being abandoned because of all these emotional driven problems. Bernays continues, present-day politics places emphasis on personality. An entire party, a platform, an international policy is sold to the public, or it is not sold, on the basis of the intangible element of personality. A charming candidate is the alchemist's secret that can transmute a prosaic platform into the gold of votes. It is essential for the campaign manager to educate the emotions in terms of groups. The public is not made up merely of Democrats and Republicans. People today are largely uninterested in politics, and their interest in the issues of the campaign must be secured by coordinating it with their personal interests. The public is made up of interlocking groups: economic, social, religious, educational, culture, racial, collegiate, local, sports, and hundreds of others. When President Coolidge invited actors for breakfast, he did so because he realized not only that actors were a group, but that audiences, the large group of people who like amusements, who like people who amuse them, and who like people who can be amused, ought to be aligned with him. Now we see, again, even a further moving away from solutions and policy to emotion and personality. We see that the propagandist breaks down the people into these little boxes. He says economic as a social status class, which is really going to be everyone. We might have varying varying economic standings, but really everyone is affected by the economic conditions of the country. I believe Bill Clinton ran on one of his slogans was, "It's the economy, stupid." I think that's a legitimate slogan. I think it actually is correct, and I think it's always correct. It wasn't only correct back in, let's say, 92, whenever he said it, but I think it's correct today. And I think that a lot of what we see today are distractions to keep people away from understanding the economic conditions that are, in my opinion, and I can support this, my opinion, they are the foundation of the decline we see in the Western society and really the whole world. So anyway, the propagandist breaks these people down into their little boxes, whether it's economic, religious, racial, etc. We do not see the same, what we might call divide and conquer tactics used here today. Like, isn't this exactly what we're seeing? I mean, he specifically says religious, cultural, racial. I mean, are these not the hot button issues of today? Like racism, they say it's everywhere. I mean, I think it's a bunch of malarkey, but they claim it. Sexism, he doesn't mention that one, but it's another hot button divisive topic. Now today we have all these countless special interest groups all vying to inject their pork into a bill. We have corporations pandering to these same groups by supporting this policy or that protest. And again, I don't think they're actually offering support. It's more lip service, virtue signaling to make their potential customers say, oh, I align with that ideology, so I'm going to purchase from company XYZ. Even the example Bernays gives is the then president, inviting actors as a publicity stunt. Not exactly because he cared about the actors, but that these people that are watching him are more concerned with the celebrity going-ons and gossip than actual policy. Even the example Bernays gives of the president inviting actors is a publicity stunt. The people are more concerned with the celebrity goings-on and gossip than they are policy. And again, we see that there are many examples of this today. How many times does any president or politician align themselves with a celebrity? And I say you can even argue that Trump and Reagan before him were celebrities first and politicians second. And though I don't really like citing movies as any kind of basis of my beliefs, I think it is warranted here to mention Idiocracy. That it's all just a big show, a big P.T. Barnum style greatest show on earth. Get into the big tent and be stupid, be angered, and vote for me. Bernays continues, the political campaign, having defined its broad objects and its basic plans, having defined the group appeal to which it must use, must carefully allocate to each of the media at hand the work which it can do with maximum efficiency. At present, the political campaigner uses, for the greatest part, the radio, the press, the banquet hall, the mass meeting, the lecture platform, and the stump, generally as a means for furthering his ideas. But this is only a small part of what may be done. Actually, there are infinitely more varied events that can be created to dramatize the campaign and to make people talk of it. Exhibitions, contests, institutes of politics, the cooperation of educational institutions, the dramatic cooperation of groups which hitherto have not been drawn into active politics, and many others may be made the vehicle for the presentation of the ideas to the public. But whatever is done, it must be synchronized accurately with all other forms of public appeal. News reaches the public through the printed word. Books, magazines, letters, posters, circulars and banners, newspapers. Through pictures, photographs and motion pictures. Through the ear, lectures, speeches, band music, radio, campaign songs. All of these must be employed if the political party is to succeed. And here we can see he lists all these any and every avenues for disseminating the synchronized message that all these channels should be employed. And today, while all of these things might not be as apropos, we have things more like social media and influencers that can be added to this list at a bare minimum. But the same idea exists. They want to have a sort of a unifying message and broadcast that message across all platforms. He continues, it is understood that the methods of propaganda can be effective only with a voter who makes up his mind on the basis of his group prejudices and desires. And I know I'm belaboring this here, but Bernays is constantly saying things like prejudice and desires are what the voter must use to make up his mind, and not policies and solutions. Again, it's always an appeal to emotion, to groupthink, to going along. You don't want to stand up and be, an individual. It's always emotion and not policies, not solutions. He continues, quote, it is not necessary for the politician to be a slave of the public's group prejudices if he can learn how to mold the mind of the voters in conformity with his own ideas of public welfare and public service. The important thing for the statesman of our age is not how to know how to please the public, but to know how to sway the public. And again, we see more of the same language molding the minds of the voters. And does this not contradict his other, although less numerous, passages about how the leader or corporation is really beholden to the public? We need to study the public so that we can give them what they want. The reality is they study the public so they can better manipulate them and make them ask for the exact thing that the politician or the corporation is selling. He continues, but campaigning is only an incident in political life. The process of government is continuous, and the expert use of propaganda is more useful and fundamental, although less striking, as an aid to democratic administration than as an aid to vote-getting. Good government can be sold to a community just as any other commodity can be sold. I often wonder whether the politicians of the future who are responsible for maintaining the prestige and effectiveness of their party will not endeavor to train politicians who are at the same time propagandists. I talked recently with George Ulvaney. He said that a certain number of Princeton men were joining Tammany Hall. If I were in his place, I should have taken some of my brightest young men and set them to work for Broadway theatrical productions, or apprenticed them as assistants to professional propagandists before recruiting them to the service of the party. The newspaper man looks to him, the politician, for news, and by his power of giving or withholding information, the politician can often effectively censor political news. Now we finally see some explicit stating of what I have mentioned several times before: propaganda being used in politics directly instead of business, and how he says, again, explicitly, government can be sold just as any other commodity. Politicians of the future, that would be now, they might treat trained propagandists, or at least employ them, which they certainly do. And he says that Broadway, or today we would probably say Hollywood, tactics might be employed for selling a candidate. And finally, we see that the then politician was able to, by his position of disseminating information, censor political news. Do you think today that big tech, being in bed with most of our politicians, would have any kind of similar results? We already know this, and I suspect it is only the tip of the iceberg from the Twitter files, reports that the government and Twitter, before Elon Musk purchased it, but I wouldn't be shocked to find similar going-ons still occurring now, the Twitter and the government were working together, hand in glove, to censor what they deemed as bad opinions. And they'll say things like misinformation and disinformation, but all that really is stuff that they don't want you to hear. He continues, let us suppose that he is campaigning on a low-tariff platform. He may use the modern mechanism of the radio to spread his views, but he will almost certainly use the psychological method of propaganda to approach which in old Andrew Jackson's day, and which business has largely discarded. He will say over the radio, vote for me and low tariff, because the high tariff increases the cost of things you buy. He may, it is true, have the great advantage of being able to speak by radio directly to 50 million listeners. But he is making an old-fashioned approach. He is arguing with them. He is assaulting, single-handed, the resistance of inertia. If he were a propagandist, on the other hand, although he would still use the radio, he would use it as one instrument of a well-planned strategy. Since he is campaigning for the issue of low tariff, he not merely would tell the people that a high tariff increases the cost of the things they buy, but would create circumstances which would make this contention dramatic and self-evident. He would perhaps stage a low-tariff exhibition simultaneously in 20 cities, with exhibits illustrating the additional cost due to the tariff in force. He would see that these exhibitions were ceremoniously inaugurated by prominent men and women who were interested in low tariff apart from any interest in his personal political fortunes. He would have groups whose interests were especially affected by high tariff costs of living, institute an agitation for lower schedules. He would dramatize the issue, perhaps by having prominent men boycott woolen clothes and go to important functions in cotton suits until the wool schedule was reduced. He might get the opinion of social workers as to whether high cost of wool endangers the health of the poor in the winter. In whatever way he dramatizes the issue, the attention of the public would be attracted to the question before he addressed them personally. Then, when he spoke to his millions of listeners on the radio, he would not seek to force an argument down their throats by making them think of other things and annoyed by another demand on its attention. On the contrary, he would be answering the spontaneous questions and expressions of emotional demands of the public already keyed to a certain pitch interest in the subject. And here we see a lot of the same tactics that he was speaking about a few chapters ago when selling velvet, soap, and pianos. And here we see how it might not have seemed like a big deal, again, who really cares about velvet, soap, or pianos, But the same tactic can be used to manipulate the people on much more important political positions. The idea of planting ideas in the public mind via dramatization prior to giving a speech is kind of like predictive programming. It is a tactic where you kind of prime the pump by alluding to something that you plan on addressing later so the target audience doesn't feel blindsided. I also find it quite interesting here that boycotts are mentioned. I think today that boycotts are a very effective way to enact change, both consumer and political change. Now, the boycotts of the last decade or so have been largely ineffective. We can remember things like when the NFL was taking a knee, there was a boycott. When Target was promoting LGBT clothing at the front of their store, there was a boycott. But in more recent days, they have become a little more effective. Again, we see Bud Light promoting LGBT. They had a lot of backlash and they lost a lot of money. I think that this, what they call cancel culture, has been largely applied beyond the actual canceling to dissuade people from boycotting. This is pretty silly in my opinion, as they are not the same at all. Boycotting and cancel culture are not the same at all. Cancel culture is often bullying a person out of their position. It's often spearheaded by a small vocal minority. They say, oh, you did something that we don't like, so you're going to, again, the small vocal minority is going to attack the advertisers to get that person fired, versus boycotting, on the other hand, is, I would say, a true market force and only works when the majority stops buying. I do plan on exploring this a bit more deeply in a future video. I think it's very important. But again, if you have millions of people not buying a product and they go out of business, it's obviously because the people didn't want to buy the product. But when you have a small group of people attack the advertisers, it's not really the will of the people, it's the will of those loud few people. Bernays continues, quote, "It will be objected, of course, that propaganda will tend to defeat itself as its mechanism becomes obvious to the public. My opinion is that it will not. The only propaganda which will ever tend to weaken itself as the world becomes more sophisticated and intelligent is propaganda that is untrue or unsocial. Again, the objection is raised that propaganda is utilized to manufacture our leading political personalities. It is asked whether, in fact, the leader makes propaganda or whether propaganda makes the leader. There is a widespread impression that a good press agent can puff up a nobody into a great man. The answer is the same as that has been made of the old query as to whether the newspaper makes public opinion or whether public opinion makes the newspaper. There has to be fertile ground for the leader and its idea to fall on, but the leader also has to have some vital seed to sow. To use another figure, a mutual need has to exist before either can become positively effective. Propaganda is of no use to the politician unless he has something to say which the public, consciously or unconsciously, wants to hear." This passage here reminds me of the Hegelian dialectic, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or more commonly stated, problem, reaction, solution. This is where you want a particular outcome, so you create a problem that will elicit a reaction that will ultimately lead to your desired outcome. If you read the Project for a New American Century report that was published a few months before 9/11, you might come to the conclusion that the USA wanted to invade the Middle East. And to synthesize this solution, you kind of work backwards, and Project for a New American Century said explicitly that we needed a new Pearl Harbor. That was the thesis. And a few months later, well, I suppose that the thesis would have been the new Pearl Harbor. A few months later, 9/11 happens. That was the thesis. And then the response, the reaction, the antithesis here was an outcry from the public in support of invading the Middle East. And then the final synthesis or solution was the United States moved into the Middle East. And we can see Bernays basically saying the same thing, where you have to have the public want something to be receptive of hearing that message. But what he doesn't say is you could easily create a problem that would provoke them into wanting a particular solution. Just like a new Pearl Harbor begets 9/11, begets a U.S. presence in the Middle East. Bernays continues, but even supposing that a certain propaganda is untrue or dishonest, we cannot on that account reject the methods of propaganda as such, for propaganda in some form will always be used when leaders need to appeal to their constituents. And again, he makes these bold statements without a lick of evidence. It doesn't mean he's necessarily wrong, but he presupposes that propaganda will, quote, always be used, and that simply doesn't have to be true. It might be true, but it doesn't have to be true. He continues, quote, the public actions of America's chief executive are, if one chooses to put it that way, stage managed. But there are chosen to represent and dramatize the man in his function as representative of the people. A political practice which has its roots in the tendency of popular leader to follow oftener than he leads is the technique of the trial balloon, which he uses in order to maintain, as he believes, contact with the public. But he often does not know what the disturbances mean, whether they are superficial or fundamental. So he sends up his balloon. He may send out an anonymous interview through the press. He then waits for the reverberations to come from the public, a public which expresses itself in mass meetings or resolutions, telegrams, or even such obvious manifestations as editorials in the partisan and nonpartisan press. On the basis of these repercussions, he then publicly adopts his original tentative policy, or rejects it, or modifies it to conform to the sum of the public which has reached him. It is a method which has little justification. If a politician is a real leader, he will be able, by the skillful use of propaganda, to lead the people instead of following the people by means of the clumsy instrument of trial and error. We see these same trial balloon tactics even lambasted here by Bernays, but they're still being used today. I think a more interesting part of this last passage is the anonymous interviews. There's no mention of how something through, like let's say the CIA's Operation Mockingbird, a group, in this case executives in the United States, could use their close ties with the media to plant anonymous interviews, not only to gauge public responsiveness to a particular policy as a trial balloon, but also to nudge the public into accepting policies by way of normalization. Again, I think I mentioned in one of the other chapters, these anonymous sources, or in this case, anonymous interviews, you could literally just lie or make things up or promote a particular narrative to get people to rally behind it. Bernays continues, the propagandist's approach is the exact opposite of the politician just described. The whole basis of successful propaganda is to have an objective and then to endeavor to arrive at it through the exact knowledge of the public and modifying circumstances to manipulate and sway the public. And again, we see exactly what I just said. The propagandist will use these anonymous interviews as an example to, quote, manipulate and sway the public, where he says the trial balloon is bad because the trial balloon is used to gauge the public's feeling and then make policy based on the public's feeling. Here he's saying that's worthless. We're just going to manipulate you into feeling whatever we want you to feel. He continues, the political leader of today should be a leader as finely versed in the technique of propaganda as in political economy and civics. If he remains merely a reflection of the average intelligence of his community, he might as well go out of politics. If one is dealing with a democracy in which the herd and the group follow those whom they recognize as leaders, why should not the young men training for leadership be trained in its technique as well as in its idealism? When the interval between the intellectual classes and the practical classes is too great, says historian Buckle, the former will possess no influence and the latter will reap no benefits. Propaganda bridges this interval in our modern complex civilization. And here again we see Bernays alluding to the common man as unintelligent, although he says average intelligence, and the propagandists and the leaders, well, they're the truly intelligent ones. And putting aside the argument of democracy versus republic in the case of the United States, isn't democracy supposed to be something akin to the will of the people? And if that is the case, why would he compare the people to a herd following a leader? Again, it should be the leader following the herd via democracy. And again, I'm not saying that's the best. We have a republic, but that's an argument for another topic. Bernays continues, quote, "Only through the wise use of propaganda will our government, consider as the continuous administrative organ of the people, be able to maintain that intimate relationship with the public which is necessary in a democracy. As David Lawrence pointed out in a recent speech, there is need for an intelligent interpretive bureau for our government in Washington. There should, I believe, be an Assistant Secretary of State who is familiar with the problem of dispensing information to the press, someone whom the Secretary of State can call for consultation and who has sufficient authority to persuade the Secretary of State to make public that which, for insufficient reason, has been suppressed. The function of the propagandist is much broader in the scope than that of a mere dispenser of information to the press. The United States government should create a Secretary of Public Relations as a member of the President's cabinet. The function of this official should be to correctly to interpret America's aims and ideals throughout the world and to keep the citizens of this country in touch with governmental activities and the reasons which prompt them. He would, in short, interpret the people to the government and the government to the people. Such an official would be neither a propagandist nor a press agent in the ordinary understanding of those terms. He would be, rather, a trained technician who would be helpful in analyzing the public thought and public trends in order to keep the government informed about the public and the people informed about the government. America's relations with South America and with Europe would be greatly improved under such circumstances. Ours must be a leadership democracy administered by the intelligent minority who know how to regiment and guide the masses. Here again, he continues to harp on this intelligent people need to lead, and to do so, he suggests a Secretary of Public Relations. While I don't think this official title exists in the White House these days, it completely exists unofficially. Press secretaries would probably be what we call them today, and while we only see the Psaki's and Jean-Pierre's, you can rest assured that there is an entire apparatus working behind the scenes to predetermine what questions and answers will be handled at the next conference. There's no doubt about this, and the evidence is the giant book of answers that they flip through before reading their canned responses at each of these conferences. Maybe they don't know exactly what questions are going to be asked, but they have a really good idea. And again, they have canned responses. They have this giant telephone-sized book of canned responses. Bernays continues, "Is this government by propaganda? Call it, if you prefer, government by education. But education, in the academic sense of the word, is not sufficient. It must be enlightened expert propaganda, through the creation of circumstances, through high spotting of significant events and dramatization of important issues. The statesman of the future will thus be enabled to focus the public mind on crucial points of policy and regiment a vast heterogeneous mass of voters to clear understanding and intelligent action." And again, in the most absolutely on-brand way, Bernays says we shouldn't call it propaganda. No, let's use a better word. Let's call it education. And his future, again, our current leaders, I use the term loosely, leaders, use the techniques of high spotting and dramatization to, quote, regiment the masses and lead them by, quote, intelligent action. And again, this assumes that the masses, unled, would act unintelligently. And I think that's a very poor take. I think the average man on the street knows what's best for him. Now, we see countless examples of this high spotting and dramatization in political issues every day to this day. A president will harp on about a sliver of the economy, maybe an unemployment number, a jobs created number, a green energy plan. They will beat the drums of war by focusing on one side of the conflict, on one statement or one report. They will laud the one thing about them that is good and lambast the thing about the other, their rival, that is bad. And typically, we have high spotting or maybe low spotting in some cases. Likewise, we see the dramatization of when they try to spin things as human interest stories to tug at your heartstrings. A really common example of this is when they say things like, think of the children. We need to censor the internet of, let's say, pornography. Think of the children. We need to allow illegal immigration. Think of the children. And they put you these pictures of young people in cages. Or we need to get drugs off the streets. Think of the children. And we're going to do stop and search, frisk and search, something like that. All in the name of saving the children. And then they might kind of ask, well, you don't hate children, do you? It's all manufactured to generate an emotional response. Clearly you want to protect the children, so give up a bunch of your rights. Now, I think here in closing that this chapter really starts to make my case that propaganda isn't particularly a big deal when it comes to manipulating people to buy velvet hats or parlor pianos, although I still agree that it's underhanded. But when it turns to the manipulation of people in the political sense, I would go so far as to call it a soft coup or some kind of an invasion. There's a thing called, quote, the long march through the institutions. And this is a perfect example of how people like Rudi Dutschke and Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School planned a literal revolution by slowly acclimating people to ever more extreme ideologies. These ideologies would be dripped into institutions like schools, businesses, and government, and every generation would allow another step to be normalized. After several generations, you find yourself quite far from the initial ideology. So the idea here is, if you can train someone up to be an activist, revolutionary, if you will, and then they get a job as a teacher. They're just an entry-level teacher. Over the years, they work their way up through the ranks, and they gain tenure. Maybe they even move into the administrative department. While they're there, over an entire career, let's say 40 years or so, their ideology spreads to their coworkers, at least to some degree. Eventually, they'll capture, let's say, the HR department. And if you're an HR department, secret political activist, if you will, you're going to be more likely to hire people whose ideology aligns with your own. Continue this for a few generations, and you have what we see today, what I would consider the left's ability to capture the school system. The school system has always been fairly liberal, but open-minded up until maybe the 90s or so. Nowadays, it is full-on hard left-wing extremists, you might say. And another example, and I know I drone about this a lot, but it is such an obvious example. It's this modern-day LGBT movement. And when I say modern day, it's 2024. Now, if we think back to before the 1990s, the LGBT culture was underground, in the closet. Then I remember stories of people like Matthew Shepard. Now, these stories were misrepresented, but they were used to sell the youth on the acceptance of homosexuality. I specifically remember this story. They said that Matthew Shepard was killed because he was gay, when if you look a little deeper into it, he was embroiled in all kinds of drug dealing. I don't know exactly what happened, but it seems unlikely that they killed him just because he was gay. And then they made arguments like, oh, they were born this way. They're people just like you and I. They don't deserve to be kept in the closet. Their love is as real as a heterosexual love. What happens in your bedroom is your own business. It's between two consenting adults. Now, all of these, in hindsight, still seem perfectly reasonable. And my generation accepted this fairly completely. In high school and college, for me, there was no anti-LGBT homosexual backlash. There were gay people that I went to school with, it wasn't really that big of a deal. They didn't push their ideology down our throats. Now fast forward a decade or so later, and we have the institution of marriage was changed. Now I'll ignore the ridiculousness of why the government should be involved in your marriage whatsoever and why there should be sort of tax advantages for being married. That's a whole other topic. But a decade later, after the institution of marriage was changed, we see basically the complete acceptance of homosexual behavior. They aren't in the closet anymore, and in many cases, they're full-on celebrated. We see more than just tokens. Well, maybe they're still only tokens, but we see the LGBT people on TV. They're in the movies. They're held up as brave and prideful, and they are almost seen as role models. Now, you add one more decade to this, and what do we have? Pride Month, corporate sponsorship, all the rainbow logos, BMW rainbow logo, etc. You have like hormone blockers for 10-year-olds. You have sex reassignment surgeries. You have legal action, literal legal action against anyone who criticizes the new protected LGBT class. And what happens? Well, what happened, I should say, is baby steps after baby steps. This idea of LGBT acceptance slowly crept along, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves at drag queen story hour and naked parades down Main Street. And every step of the way, it didn't seem that big of a deal. Yes, they're just the same as us. What happens between two consenting adults? Okay, we're going to put them on TV because they're a real people. There are gay people out there, certainly. And then drag queen story hour. It's, how did you go bankrupt? Slowly at first, then all at once. How did the LGBT take over? Slowly at first, but then all at once. Now, let's apply these same tactics to politics. Not that long ago, Democrats were the anti-war party. They stood up for the working class. The Republicans were pro-business and wanted small government. Today, neither party is anti-war. The Democrats work with big tech. The Republicans are more pro-worker, but not really. And small government, they want to poke their noses into everything. All of this happened in the same way as the LGBT movement came to power. Small steps, one election at a time, one policy at a time. A carefully crafted propaganda regime to deliver a particular narrative, loaded with high spotting and dramatization, all intended to tug at your heart and get you angry at the other side so that you're going to make irrational, emotional decisions. So with that, we are at the end of this chapter. I think it was a really important chapter, probably the most important that I've covered so far. And when we see how, again, the tactics used in business can be applied to politics, which much more dire results. Well, if you want to look over these show notes, you can find them at my website, howtoeatanelephant.xyz. If you like the video or have any questions or comments, leave them below. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you really like the video, you can donate at howtoeatanelephant.xyz. I would not be averse to that. If you can't donate or don't want to donate, but you still want to help me out, like and subscribe or share the video with anybody that you might think finds it interesting. That would be greatly appreciated. And so with all of that said, I would like to thank you for your time and attention. I know this was a long one, and I hope that you have a good night.